I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points. In today's episode, we are diving into the high-stakes world of aviation cybersecurity to illuminate an important universal theme. Cybersecurity is much more than data breach notice requirements. In some place, cyber is the difference between life and death. With stakes that high, I think we can all agree that cybersecurity is imperative, and our approach to securing our critical infrastructure is never more important. That's frankly not easy, especially given how fragmented cybersecurity strategy is within particular industry sectors and how complicated supply chains are today. To discuss these issues, I've invited my friend Adam Smith to the podcast. Adam is the regulatory lead at Southwest Airlines on cybersecurity and is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Law Center, where he teaches incident response. I'm really excited to have Adam join today to unpack the complex landscape of cyber and physical security in the aviation space, and importantly, explore how critical infrastructure is protected against increasingly sophisticated threats. Everything from the unique challenges of securing aircraft systems to the legal and operational intricacies of responding to cyber incidents, this conversation can shed light on the evolving role of cybersecurity professionals in keeping the skies safe. And also, it gives insight into the role of cybersecurity professionals when the stakes are at the highest. Maybe to illuminate that point, maybe to brag, I'm going to give you a fair warning. I might just compare us to Bruce Willis in Die Hard 2 and Ben Affleck in The Sum of All Fears as we fight terrorism both in the skies and in large stadiums. You won't want to miss that. With that, Adam, I want to welcome you to the podcast.
Thanks, Scott. Glad to be here.
So, Adam, you have a very kind of interesting position in the cybersecurity space, including kind of the role that you play. It may be helpful just to hear a little bit about your background and how you first got into cybersecurity.
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey. Just to start off with housekeeping items, the things I do say are my personal views, not those of Southwest Airlines or any other organization. So that's where I'm at these days. But where things started really was during law school. I worked for the government in a cybersecurity role. And after law school, it was 2018. Things were really starting to kick off on the cybersecurity side outside of specifically highly regulated industries. And since then, it's been kind of another one breach after another, one incident after another, helping companies, large, small, everything in between, navigate both the technical risks that come with cybersecurity and then, of course, the compliance obligations. And in my role now, I'm really looking ahead to the future of where we want the cybersecurity standards, frameworks, requirements for tomorrow to be to really enhance the cybersecurity of the transportation sector and really critical infrastructure.
Yeah, and Adam, that's the part where I would really want us to maybe focus first because I think cynical people when they look at cybersecurity and they say, what is the point any longer? All of our data is already out there. And, how many times am I going to get a breach notice for me to feel like that I don't just already expect that my personal data is public in some form, right? I don't aspire to that view myself, but I'll tell you that that view, and you probably have heard it yourself, that view is out there. But let's think about cyber slightly different than just saying, hey, there is an incident, results in the release of personal information. That information then gets out there, and then people have to, get some sort of relief from either, the damages they occur and all of that. So we'll not talk about like notices. Let's talk about what cyber in your world could be life and death, right? Or at least it could be, issues surrounding whether people can move in the way that they need to move, or that business can operate in the way that it is because a lot of people rely on you and the Southwest Airlines to be a key component and stakeholder in their operations. So maybe from your perspective, how do you think about cyber and the importance of cyber in running what is critical infrastructure?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Scott, because it's from the legal side, it's easy to think of some of the more kind of historical things that have been involved with cybersecurity, the notices, going back to GDPR, the breach notifications, consents, things like that. But when we're talking about critical infrastructure, it's not a surprise that we are more dependent on technology today than ever before. And there have been some great podcasts on some of the directions that AI is going and other new and evolving technology and corresponding regulatory considerations are going. But from a critical infrastructure perspective, it really is could be life and death. And it's definitely something where safety is of utmost importance to critical infrastructure, as it should be. And cybersecurity and security in general is becoming more closely related to safety because they both go hand in hand. And when you look at, the transportation infrastructure as a whole, if you go through just the critical infrastructure groups within the transportation sector, you're talking about rail, you're talking about air, you're talking about airports. Those aren't just things that are used on the civilian side for commercial purposes. Those would be the things that the Department of War would use in the event of a activation of the US military, whether it's for ground transportation or air transportation or some combination of both. And so looking at the way the world is today, we're not just looking at kind of people who are looking to make a few quick bucks off of a ransomware attack. We're also looking at everything between that and nation state actors that could seek to inflict harm, not specifically on a particular company in the critical infrastructure sector, but on the United States as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, and Adam, I wouldn't ever probably compare us, to Hollywood stars in our normal day-to-day lives. But as you're describing this and, hearing about the issues that you manage and then, issues that I see, maybe we have a future in creating Hollywood scripts maybe in one day because, we talked about, you think of like Die Hard 2, which was all about, terrorists taking over planes and then having those planes drop out of the sky, from a terrorist or, opportunity. But one of the things that I do, and I represent a number of companies who are, call it in the large event space, like they put on events with a large number of people who are gathering all in the same spot. And then all of a sudden that becomes a target for terrorism, acts of war, all of these various things that could happen, in which case cybersecurity is used as a tool to be able to compromise both systems that could result in, death and large scale death in that matter. And so, I'm thinking then it, could be the version of the Sum of All Fears, if you remember that movie, where, there was a nuclear device that blew up a football game, right? And like, imagine that you have a scenario where you have a bunch of people packed into a concert and the lights turn off and the turnstiles don't work and people can't get out. And then all of a sudden, the PA system, they say, hey, we have a bomb here. And what happens? And you're going to have chaos, right? So that's my brief aside to think that, hey, this is actually real stuff. And it is much different than perhaps what some people think of as a notice, an area where you're going to provide credit monitoring and you're going to, be subject to a class action lawsuit, all of which are real, all of which are important. But here is where you actually have, people's lives at stake if we didn't get this right.
Yeah, well, and that's a great example, Scott. If you just start at the beginning, though, of where you start causing fear, if you start turning off the lights, even that one simple ability can create mass panic, can create confusion, can create the kinds of things that really do impact the critical infrastructure of the United States. So whether it's a kind of doomsday worst case scenario or even something that independently may not seem like a worst case situation, public panic and fear is a real thing. I remember from back in my DHS days, there was this line that Homeland Security starts with hometown security. And so even the small situations, the small, airports, small train stations, small whatever it may be, could end up being a headline nationally and globally that creates panic, fear, the kinds of things that inhibit the use of critical infrastructure in the United States. So even small things can be big things too.
All right. So I'm convinced this is a really important issue. And I am also convinced in the way that you're describing it is that it is not easy to solve. And as a result, my guess is that the legal overlay for trying to address this really important issue, which goes to the core of health and safety, is going to be also difficult for regulators and legislators to establish a set of policies, a set of regulations, a set of legal principles, whatever it is that you want to call it, that's going to give clear direction about what the minimum levels of expectations are and how companies should be able to operate in this space. So I know you work through that issue for a living. Maybe for our audience, give us a big picture here. Where do you see leadership coming from on these issues? Where do you see it coming in from a number of different stakeholders, all of whom have a view into how critical infrastructure should try to solve for some of these issues, and then how your perspective is on how to solve for all of those differing policy requirements.
That is where I spend most of my time these days, for sure. And I think it really comes down to the creation of the federal departments and the authorities that federal departments have over transportation and transportation security. If you look at the Department of Transportation, they're obviously responsible for the safety and security of the transportation infrastructure in the United States, whether it's highways or rail or aviation. But then we have a Transportation Security Administration, Transportation Security Agency, that is separate from the Department of Transportation within the Department of Homeland Security, created after September 11th. They have very broad authorities to ensure the security of U.S. critical infrastructure and specifically transportation. And so you have two department level authorities that are different, with different histories, different personalities, different regulatory authorities, and they're not necessarily integrated. And we saw with CERCIA, we saw a movement from the Department of Homeland Security towards harmonizing at least the incident reporting requirements, but you still have different departments outside of the Department of Homeland Security. You have a piece of this puzzle. And then the other wrinkle is, we mentioned this a bit earlier, the Defense Department uses the channels and the instrumentalities that the Department of Transportation and the Department of Homeland Security both regulate in the event of wartime or in the event of military services. And so you really have three key department level regulators. And then in addition to that, most of the larger entities in the transportation critical infrastructure sector are also public companies. So you have the Securities Exchange Commission. You obviously have international considerations, recognizing that a lot of our transportation companies do have an international nexus. And of course, the state considerations too. So it's, even once you start expanding things out, there's a lot of different people who have a lot of different, sometimes overlapping, sometimes not overlapping pieces of the puzzle. But when it comes to cybersecurity, there's no one singular authority that's responsible for the safety and security of transportation.
Yeah. And, I think you're really keying in on an issue that sounds like it's specific to transportation, but I don't think it is. It is an area where, most sectors in the United States, at least, have a variety of cybersecurity expectations and requirements, but not a single list of cybersecurity requirements or expectations. In other words, they get it from multiple different places, inclusive of, and interested in your perspective on this, and that because we don't have a single, call it cybersecurity regulator, in the same way that we don't have a single privacy regulator, and because that is so, the regulation of industry and the regulation of specific companies comes in so many different directions. If you don't have somebody who is entrusted for cybersecurity, that creates a bit of a vacuum. And thus, all of the other entities who have a role in regulations then try to fill that regulatory vacuum with their own views on cybersecurity, even though they themselves are probably not the cybersecurity regulators or have the expertise to understand the cybersecurity issues that most of their regulated entities have to deal with.
Exactly. And this is, if you go back to Presidential Policy Directive 21 in 2013, that created at least the current concept of the critical infrastructure sectors and separated them out into transportation and others. PPD 21, or Presidential Policy Directive 21, established what they called sector risk management agencies, or SIRMAs. And some sectors have just one sector risk management agency, but transportation won't surprise you, has two: the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Transportation. And so, even looking back to when we kind of created the current understanding of critical infrastructure sectors, there really isn't a clear division between what is on the Department of Homeland Security side and what's on the Department of Transportation side. They're both listed as sector risk management agencies. So it's been a part of the reality, even as we look at critical infrastructure sectors. But then fast forward to today, there still hasn't been a clear delineation between, okay, we have a security event. Is that something that which federal agency is going to be on point for? And I think the same thing is true if you look at rail or pipeline or other transportation related entities that would fall within the Transportation Security Administration's authority.
Yeah, I think it's really important, and I think it kind of indicative of what really every industry is dealing with, especially those who have that clear nexus to something larger than just personal data, which in some ways is every one of them. Whether you're selling groceries or issuing credit cards, or whether you are in the position of transportation, or if you are providing defense departments, or I'm sorry, departments of war oriented goods and services, right? Like all of them have these connections, and it's actually much bigger than the personal information. But let's think about this then. If trying to be in a position of bringing some level of coordination and strategy about managing to these multiple obligations, because as you're describing it, Adam, you have all of these different requirements. In some cases, the transportation industry in the US is at least a little bit easier than if you have all of the states who are also trying to kind of impose their own versions of these things. If you don't have that issue, then at least you're working with a known set of federal regulators, but they are not necessarily coordinating. And I think where oftentimes this comes into an issue is when there's an incident. And I know this is an issue that you've thought about from a policy perspective through a variety of different roles that you serve outside of Southwest. And how is it that you can bring levels of harmonization between these different regulatory requirements, and who is it that you are reporting to whenever you have an issue? What is it that you're reporting? Why are you reporting that? And to what end are we trying to spend those first critical hours figuring out notification obligations versus remediation and containment issues? So interested in your perspective on how that gets sorted in real life, and if you have views about perhaps better ways of doing it.
Yeah, it's certainly complex. And I think the first step is to identify what the requirements actually are, because there's not a, cybersecurity reporting requirements for transportation industry stakeholders.gov. They're in a number of different places, whether it's a regulation or an agreement with a government organization, or some combination of both. It can be difficult to find where the cybersecurity reporting obligations are, because sometimes they're specific to cyber, but sometimes they're specific to security or operational continuity or other things that don't say the word cyber, but could be impacted by a cybersecurity event nonetheless. And so once you identify really what the scope is of those requirements, then you get into the squishy land of, okay, where might it be helpful to share information with the government for a strategic purpose? Because we're dealing with a certain potential threat actor, or we might not have the information that we need, or we're working with a third party that may have already provided information to the government. Sitting at Southwest now and looking at things from a practical perspective, the whole purpose of information sharing with the government in general is to enhance the security of critical infrastructure. I think you can put the SEC reporting and some of the other things on the side, but in general, when we're looking at critical infrastructure, at least unique critical infrastructure reporting obligations, the ultimate objective is raising the standard for cybersecurity. And when something does go wrong, do we have the right public-private resources and information flowing to be able to resolve that issue as quickly and as safely as possible? And so it's not only just the mandatory reporting, it's also the voluntary coordination that sometimes goes hand in hand, but you still need to keep those distinct from a compliance perspective to make sure you don't create more problems by trying to solve technical cybersecurity ones. And then I think the last thing to think about is it's not just cyber who has these relationships with the federal stakeholders. You've got a number of other departments within a company who have separate relationships for separate and interrelated purposes, whether it be safety, whether it be operational continuity, whether it be something different. And so the reporting isn't necessarily coming through the same attorneys or coming from the same individuals within an organization. And so tracking internally, what is the messaging regarding this incident is more important than ever before, because now you don't just have internal coordination, you have external coordination across the various government organizations that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that dynamic is fascinating and a real challenge, inclusive of how to sort through that, maybe what I could describe as a mess, in when you're in a position where you only have a couple of hours to do it. So, any thoughts from your perspective, Adam, about how organizations can plan for these types of events and then effectively respond to all of these competing and differing requirements in the heat of the crisis?
The same things that I learned as a young attorney, I think are just as true, if not more true today, in terms of having a really good incident response process that is actionable, that people are aligned on, making sure the right stakeholders are involved, and the right legal stakeholders too, because we oftentimes don't just work with the cybersecurity legal stakeholders. There could be other relevant stakeholders that may have additional components of an incident if it's large enough or complex enough. And then making sure you actually exercise that. Hopefully, this is not something an organization sees frequently enough to test it in the heat of actual battle, but to actually stress test who are your key partners within the legal department, within this technology team, outside of the technology team, and I found the most productive conversations aren't in a worst case scenario doomsday, because escalation is pretty easy when you're talking doomsday. What about the smaller things where things just seem a little bit off? Are there the right triggers to get the right information to the right people, and the right coordination early on? Because it's so much easier to save a few hours at the beginning of an event than try to do it on the back end. And then the last thing that I think is pretty unique and special to transportation is that our regulators are also our service providers. So we get services from the Department of Transportation in terms of managing the air traffic control network and providing resources to our pilots in flight, and to really manage the National Airspace System, or the NAS. Similarly, with the Transportation Security Administration, I was talking with their front office a few weeks ago, and they made the point that, look, of all the DHS, Department of Homeland Security entities, we have more direct interaction with Americans than any other Department of Homeland Security agency or component. And it's really the folks at the airport doing the important work of screening passengers. And so it's not just a regulated entity type of relationship. There's also a partnership to that, because the success of the regulator is also the success of the regulated entity. And so making sure that the right information is flowing early on, because the worst case scenario is you create just a compliance checkbox kind of mentality that either impedes or replaces the true incident response effort that's designed to restore security, to keep things safe and operational, and to keep the business and really the critical infrastructure community running.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you said a number of really important things we could spend a long time kind of going through, but a couple of ones that just jumped out to me, and that one of the key components of incident response is going to be outbound communications. And that communication strategy around who is it that you're talking with and what it is that you're saying is probably, at least in my mind, top five of one of the most challenging things to do when we are dealing with IR. And if we're talking about transportation and issues surrounding how transportation providers communicate, like that's communications like requirements on on steroids in some ways, because probably everybody has been in a position where they've been mad at their airline because they've been stuck at a particular airport, or their bags are lost, or what have you. That's not reflective of Southwest. It's just basically, I think everybody's experienced that. But if we're in a position where everybody who has a ticket is stuck wherever they are, which happened not to Southwest, but to other airlines in connection with IT disruptions a while back. As you can imagine, that's a significant issue for individuals, but also a significant communication problem to disseminate information so that individuals, as they're sleeping on the airport floor, know what they can expect.
Frustrated by a breach notification. It's a little more real. No, and I
It's
think
just very different. Yeah.
that's another really important point, because distinguishing between what is a technology event, a glitch, versus a cybersecurity event, however an organization may define those or regulation may define those, is really important to distinguish, because they often can look rather similar to even an organization internally and definitely externally, and communicating the right message. Again, once you've got regulators and customers and investors and all of these other external stakeholders involved who all care about information for very different reasons, all high priority for various reasons, making sure that you get the right information to the right people at the right time is important, because worst case scenario, you have conflicting information out there. And then you're really playing defense as opposed to helping a disgruntled individual better understand what the issue is, when it'll be resolved, empowering the folks who are communicating that to individuals, whether it's at the airport or in a more large scale capacity, can really have that information that are the answers that everybody wants immediately, that may not be readily apparent. Exactly right. And
Yeah.
I think the other thing too is, you mentioned other airlines. Something that transportation stakeholders don't compete on is safety and security. Safety and security is in all of our best interests. It's in our regulators' best interests. It's in our best interests. It's in our customers' best interests. It's in our Department of War's best interest. It's critical to be aligned on safety and security. And so the same vendors that a certain organization in the sector might use are likely to be similar to, or at least relying on the same technology as, vendors that other competitors may use. And so it's interesting in those situations to have that information sharing, because take the 737, for example. We've got global operators of 737s around the world, or vendors that provide reservation systems to airlines. Again, they're servicing airlines around the world. As you start to see issues with specific situations and vendors and things like that, the same situations could apply to similarly situated vendors with other airlines or other transportation sector entities. So it's also important to be able to share some of that information, because oftentimes if you're looking at a international threat actor or a nation state threat actor, they're not looking at one airline versus another airline. They're looking at airlines collectively and the services they offer. And so it's really important to be aligned in terms of what are we seeing as the cutting edge risks, vulnerabilities, threats within the community, but also within our regulatory stakeholders.
I think it's fascinating. And then maybe another thing that I've learned from you, Adam, in our past conversations, and I think you mentioned briefly that I think is just so unique, is you mentioned that your regulators are also your service providers. And that's worth pausing on, because probably at least the folks who are in the space understand the complexity of supply chain management from a cybersecurity perspective right now, and the difficulty and danger of getting that wrong. In particular, effectively finding the weakest link in a supply chain, which resulting in the compromise of everybody in the supply chain. And if one of those entities who's into the supply chain is also the people to which you would have to report and would be holding you accountable for cybersecurity, well, that's an interesting kind of set of dynamics, including how is it that you manage those different stakeholders. Anything more you want to say about that?
Well, just one more thing to add. The same regulators also inspect or audit, in terms of not just for incidents, but if you're looking at the security controls that are being applied across the system. They're also delegated the responsibility to oversee that as well. And so I think it makes that coordination, that partnership, that much more critical, because it's not a position where an airline saying, "Hey, we don't want to have a more secure type of operation. We want to have that security, but we want to understand why and what is it that's motivating this, whether it's an emergency regulatory amendment or something else. What is the why behind the security need, and helping the various stakeholders within the community understand that, so that we really can get the right controls, the right security procedures in place. And I think that the last thing, if I can sneak one more thing in, is that all of this moves at the speed of cyber. And DC sometimes can move very fast, sometimes can move very slow. And cyber always moves very fast. And so the dynamic nature of our dependence on technology and resources, but then also the compliance that's got to go beside it. Most of our regulators started with the physical security requirements or the operational requirements that are existing within maintenance programs. And all of those are fairly static compared to cyber. And so as we have to fast forward now to apply the same types of considerations in a cyber world, we've got to be more dynamic. We've got to be more collaborative. We've got to be on the same page, because we we don't have time to sit there and think about it or negotiate. It's got to be at the speed of relevance.
That collaboration maybe is also worth pointing out, because I think another thing that's unique to the space is that while most folks say, "Oh, I'm on, an airline from X, Y, and Z," they are pointing out to the brand name that's on the outside of the plane, as if it was like a Ford, or if as if it was a Mercedes Benz, right? But the operators of those airlines, they don't make those planes, right? You purchase those planes from third parties. Those third parties will be the ones who are, taking and assembling all different pieces and components to actually then create the aircraft. And that has resulted in a much larger supply chain issue. And so that collaboration, I can imagine, is going to really require not just your own supply chain, who is providing services, not just the regulators that you were describing, but the actual manufacturers of the planes themselves, and all of the, call it the widgets that they create that have been now assembled in the plane.
Exactly. It's one of the opportunities that I've been most excited about in over the last year is the participation in RTCA, or the Radio Technical Commission for Aeronautics. They're a standard setting, independent from the U.S. government organization, and they work with their European counterpart, EUROCAE, and others to bring all the stakeholders that you just mentioned, the operators, the manufacturers, the suppliers, the regulators, together to think through what is the standard we want to hold ourselves accountable to, because they interrelate. The standard for certification of a component has got to be related to the airworthiness of that, or the operationalization of that in a certain environment. And so you need the standards to work together across the different stakeholders. And then what we've seen happen is you've got the Federal Aviation Administration, both the standard setting individuals within within the Federal Aviation Administration, you have the certification teams there, as well as the airworthiness teams. And so you're bringing together the different teams within the regulator to help make the standard something that can be actionable, not just by a US company, but by a European company or a Middle Eastern company, or any other company around the world, because we're operating very similar types of technology in very similar environments.
Yeah, I mean, I applaud the effort of kind of trying to kind of bring everybody in the room and kind of get that consensus. It is desperately needed for global business, I'm sure in the transportation sector, but also, through a number of other sectors who suffer from similar themes of cybersecurity issues in the past. I mean, as we kind of close here, Adam, I'm interested in another thing that you probably have a keen sense into, and that you are the cybersecurity regulatory or legal lead for your company. When I first started practicing, there was no such title. And in fact, when I first joined my law firm, which was then Hogan and Hartson, there was no privacy or cybersecurity practice at all, right? There was no privacy or cybersecurity class in my law school when I was doing this. So we've progressed quite a bit. But the need and an interest for organizations to have a legal partner within their organization to manage the legal component of cybersecurity is is certainly growing and has gotten much more intense interest, but is also, think about it, at least in my world, relatively new because it's not probably more than 10 years old since that concept was first created. And I think it's only now starting to see more and more. And certainly most companies probably don't have a designated cyber legal lead. So, from your perspective, how do you see that role and its importance, and then importantly, kind of how can organizations see that as a significant value add as one of the ways that they manage cybersecurity risk?
Yeah, it's a unique role, and it's one that I would actually say I'm a cybersecurity professional who has a legal background. In my cyber regulatory role now, I sit on the cyber side of the house and work closely with our legal partners and government affairs partners and others across the company. But really, it's in that position of helping make sure the compliance of tomorrow makes sense. I know you've seen this, the obligations, whether it's incident reporting or cybersecurity standards or an additional cybersecurity obligation that executive leadership has to own, whether it's the CISO or even above, looking at the board or the CEO, is just becoming more and more significant. And so that's really the my biggest advocate can be our head of compliance, because when things don't make sense, how do we get to a better place? And what I've realized over my career is that there can be a legal answer, but oftentimes the technical folks who are in the room developing that standard or that framework aren't familiar with the legal levers available to them, whether it's a legislative one or a regulatory one or a contractual one or some combination of all of the above. And so helping our technical folks who are boots on the ground on the compliance side or developing the actual controls for the company understand the resources available to them from the legal side. It goes back to the same principles that I learned as a young attorney. Cybersecurity lawyers, cybersecurity regulatory professionals should be the advocates of a chief information security officer or an advocates of the cybersecurity leadership. And as the laws and the regulations and the partnerships become more complex, I think it's important to be more embedded at a tactical, technical level than ever before, so that once the ideas start to develop, they're integrated with both technical and legal solutions from the start.
I couldn't agree more. And maybe I would add another pitch for anybody who's listening who's maybe considering a career, in a similar space. We have a number of folks who listen to this podcast who are, either law students, people who are earlier in their careers, exploring kind of what does it mean from a cyber policy, or just frankly trying to change what they do or get better at what they do. And, as I think about how the overlap between legal and cyber and where somebody in a role similar to yours creates really unique value, is that as this space starts to get more understood, and frankly the consequences for getting it wrong become higher and higher, we're always then further into the position of figuring out, well, what is it that went wrong, why did it go wrong, and how is it that we're going to try to address it. And what I see often is that, listen, bad things happen. There's very few organizations out there who have never had some sort of incident. In fact, there are probably zero organizations out there who will, during their life cycle, will never have an incident, right? Everyone's going to have it. In which case, we're starting with a different presumption of saying, did you have an incident or did you not have an incident? It's more of, what is it that you did to prevent the incident? And how is it that once the incident occurred, what did you do in response to contain and react to it? And then, frankly, how is it that you remediated and addressed those issues? And if I think about what that is, those are a lot of process questions, right? At its bottom is like thinking about, well, you had an incident, that's the result, but talk to me about all of the steps that went into that and all of the steps that you followed afterward, and how is it that you're trying to address each one of those things? Who's really good at process? Well, that's the lawyers are really good at process. And if that's the thing that's going to get the scrutiny and get everybody worked up, as to instead of saying, did you have an incident or did you not have an incident, but tell me why you had an incident, that is going to be the where lawyers can be really helpful to guide their organizations to, not only be able to effectively respond to incidents, but frankly, put them in a better position having gone through a legal level of scrutiny to make sure that those systems were more mature, more scrutinized, more strengthened from the start than they would have been if somebody were saying, well, just plug in this vendor here and we're all good, or buy this particular piece of software, hit install and then we can go home, right? Like that's not the way the legal bend would work, and thus it's a real additional value for someone in your role. That's
Well,
my
and
point.
yeah, no, and I think that that's exactly right. And maybe to add one additional thing to that is it's the lawyers who have experience with various types of companies in various types of regulatory situations, geographic considerations, legal considerations. That diversity of experience from a lawyer's perspective adds so much value. Having spent the last few years working specifically for one company, I always appreciate hearing from lawyers who are working across companies in the trenches on a daily basis. It allows folks to really get involved in the technical things that I can do now because I can still get the perspective of the lawyers who really are doing this day in and day out, and not necessarily limited by the specific experience of one particular company in one particular sector.
Yeah, I think that's really good, and I suspect, that collaboration across all of these various different ways of information sharing and continuing to, frankly, as a community, be in the position of more effectively managing a risk that probably not, any single individual or any single individual company or any single individual discipline for that matter can do on their own, really requires that broad tent. And so appreciate and applaud all of the efforts that you have done in connection not only with the role that you hold with inside of the transportation community to try to bring more sense and rationalization within the various different stakeholders, but I know in your spare time, one of the things that you do is teach young law students about incident response and cybersecurity, and that's another way of just effectively setting a higher bar day in, day out for what it is that we do.
It's a real pleasure. I always learn a ton from the law students, and I think it's fascinating that they're not limited by their experience. If you talk to a lot of cybersecurity lawyers, there's ways that we do things that make complete sense, but there's also a lot of questions we won't ask just because we know the answer. And so it's fascinating in an academic environment to really explore some of the unusual questions and innovative perspectives that are coming from a fresh perspective.
Yeah. Well, Adam, really appreciate your time today to share your experience and insights and expertise in a really fascinating space. I'm sure there will be more things to talk about in the future, so I'll have to figure out how to get you back onto the podcast, but really appreciate your time today.
Well, looking forward to it. And in the meantime, I'm looking forward to listening to future Data Chronicles.
Sounds great. All right. With that, I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and those were your data points.